Good evening, everybody. Hello. Welcome to the latest in our series of Manchester Incites lectures at Brexit on the Brink. I'm Richard Screeton, I'm head of the Alumni Relations Office here at the University of Manchester. It's great to see so many of you here this evening. Thanks very much for coming along. Before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping announcements to make. So can you all please ensure that your phones are on silent? We're not expecting a fire alarm this evening, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way outside of the building and turn right towards the Roscoe building, and then wait there for further instructions. So, on to tonight's event. The Manchester Incites event series highlights the outstanding research here at Manchester, showcases our star academics, and shares important stories on how we're tackling the big issues of the day. Nearly 3 years after the referendum and days before Britain is scheduled to leave the European Union, tonight our panel of experts will offer their insights into the Brexit process. The university's academics are regularly called on for their input by select committees and the media alike, and our Policy at Manchester initiative acts as a focal point for Manchester's expertise in this area. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing their analysis this evening. For those of you who use social media, the hashtag for tonight's event is hashtag UOM Insights. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our chair for tonight, Jim Hancock. Jim graduated from the University of Manchester in 1970 and was the political editor of BBC Northwest between 1998 and 2006. He's interviewed every Prime Minister since Harold Wilson through to David Cameron. So, over to Jim and the panel.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for coming in such numbers. I mean, it rather defies the comment they were all absolutely fed up with this and they're totally bored with it. I think actually it's energised people, perhaps not always in a good way, but it's just fantastic to see so many people here tonight. Of course, we arranged this to mark our departure from the European Union on the 29th of March, but various people conspired to confound us with our meeting, the ERG, Jeremy Corbyn, Mrs May, Nigel Farage, the SNP, Uncle Tom Cobley and all. But we are here. And what I hope we can do tonight is to take a calm and considered look at how we got to this Brexit crisis, looking back over some years. But obviously we have to acknowledge that even as we sit here now, there are developments, and I will update you as far as I can in a few moments' time. We are being live streamed as well. The format is that I will have a discussion with my two distinguished friends here, and then we're throwing it open for your questions, which we really are looking forward to. So I'm delighted to be joined by the university's experts on Brexit. No pressure there, gentlemen. Professor Edward Fieldhouse is Professor of Social and Political Science and Principal Investigator of the British Election Study. His main research interests are voting behaviour, electoral geography and social influences on electoral behaviour. And also with me is Professor Dimitris Papadimitriou, who's Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. Jean Monnet is a particular resonance to those of you who study your European history. Monnet Centre of Excellence. His research focuses on the policies and institutions of the European Union, and he's the co-editor of the book series on European politics at Manchester University Press. So we've got two really good experts here. Just to update you on the latest developments, Mrs May has said this evening that she will go when her withdrawal deal is agreed. The House is now going to sit on Friday, when you may speculate that she will attempt to put her withdrawal deal back. The Speaker has again said this afternoon, drawing her attention to his requirement that any meaningful vote 3 has to be different, which has caused huge furore. And of course the MPs are currently debating 8 alternatives, which are no deal, common market 2, EFTA, customs union, Labour's plan, revocation, the public vote and the Malthouse compromise. We've all become really familiar and expert with all these things, and I know that our colleagues will go into this in further detail. But I just thought I'd bring you up to date with exactly where we are as far as we can see. I mean, during the course of our meeting tonight, I don't expect there'll be many further developments because they will just at 7 o'clock be given these pieces of paper. And then at 7:30, of course, they will then be discussing the actual extension of the date from the 29th of March till April. And we don't expect the paper result to come out until after our meeting is ended. As you drive or go home tonight, you'll be able to pick up on that if you haven't had enough of all this by then. But as I said, let's start off, but let's try and make this reflective, Dimitris, as we start off from this. And I mean, my first question to you is to make an assessment of has Britain benefited from its membership of the European Union since we joined in 1973?
That's a difficult one. It's difficult, of course, to establish very clear causalities with all of these things. Is Britain today economically in a better state that it was in the mid-1970s? The answer is probably yes. It is in a much better. It is in a much better state. Is it because of the EU? That's harder to establish firmly. I happen to believe that the EU has contributed to the economic well-being to this country, but I also want to make it clear that how you make that connection tightly is not easy. So the answer to this is that yes, Britain today is in a better state. Is it because of the EU? Partly. What is definitely the case is that British departure from the European Union comes at a time when British influence in Europe has never been greater. And that's something that very often in the public debate has been missed. You know, people very often say, oh, you know, Britain in Europe, the Europeans don't really listen to us. We can't really make the Germans or the French do what we like. But if you look at the actual policies, today the European Union is much closer to long-term kind of policy objectives that Britain has had than any time before. Britain really wanted a much larger European Union. It was a very keen advocate of enlarging the European Union. The European Union today is much larger than what it was in the 1970s. Britain always wanted a European Union that is much more business-friendly, you know, more open to commerce and so on. The truth is that the European Union today is a much more...
was a big advocate of the single market.
Well, yeah, I mean, the European Union today, many would say, has gone too far to being pro-business and abandon some of the policies for which Jacques Delors was very popular in this country in the 1980s. Has Britain had something to do with it? Of course. I mean, a lot of what the European Union is today is not a million miles away from what Tony Blair wanted for this country, for example, right? So there is a paradox here that Britain lives at a time when its influence, at least on how the European Union operates and the policy objectives it has, that has ever been before. Now, why would Britain live at that particular moment in time? It's a different story.
Well, let me put it to Ed and make a suggestion about that. In 1973, this country was economically weak. It was felt that perhaps the European Union was a solution. The empire had finished. We were running into problems, a lot of industrial relations problems. Our economy wasn't very strong. And it was felt that the European Union was therefore we needed to get in and huddle in with some friends, putting it like that. Perhaps the answer to the question of one of the many reasons why we voted to leave is we're more confident now. You know, our economy is, you know, in 2016 was doing reasonably well, that we can stand on our own feet, and we don't need Europe so much.
That is one interpretation. I fear the whole debate recently and the whole process by which we arrived here is more to do with the party politics. It's more to do with the fact that the Conservative Party have been split over Europe for very long time, and the rise of UKIP following the increase in migration following the accession of new states from the EU meant that immigration came to the top of the political agenda, making a space for UKIP to claim votes, because both the other major parties were not very strong or very determined maybe on controlling immigration. So I think that's the driving force behind this, was the fact that you had UKIP becoming stronger and stronger, and David Cameron needed to basically make a claim to those voters by offering a referendum. And so that's not to say your statement about our confidence. I think that people, the kinds of people who voted in favour of Brexit feel that Britain is a great country. They're thinking about Britain from the past, they're thinking about empire, they're thinking about how things used to be. And I suppose that is a type of confidence. But it is that kind of belief in a kind of glorious past, which I think is perhaps more the case than a growing confidence.
Still sticking on the historical theme of this, we were twice rejected from membership of the European Union by Charles de Gaulle, who was the leader of the French. And he always said that the instinct of England or Britain, the United Kingdom, is to look to the open sea, to look to the Atlantic, and not to look to Europe. And he instinctively felt that we wouldn't, in our gut, be fully on board for the European project. And when I mentioned Mrs. Thatcher's rebate, the Schengen Agreement, opting out of this, opting out of that, the history of Britain's relations with the EU, I would suggest to you, has always been 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and wasn't de Gaulle instinctively right, and it's coming to a head now, all those years later.
I've got another slight paradox for you, Jim. I've been in this country for 25 years, and what I see today, compared with what I saw when I came here, it's actually a far more European country. The British drink, eat more European. A lot more British people holiday in Europe. The furniture they buy are much more European. So there is evidence from everyday life that Britain, in many ways, is culturally closer to Europe today than it has ever been before. This is the paradox part. At the same time, during the time at least that I've been in this university, I have seen a gradual decline of British interest on things non-British. In that sense, I think Brexit has been coming for a long time. I'll give you one example that not many people perhaps think about, but we see this a lot at the university. Is it accidental that foreign language training in this country has collapsed over the past 20 years? Is it accidental that student numbers taking degrees on what we call area studies, to learn about Europe, to learn about America, to learn about Africa, has all but disappeared? A few years ago, I got an email from somebody from the Foreign Office wanting to come here to recruit students. And I got a little bit surprised. I said, why do they come to Manchester? I'm sure Oxford and Cambridge have enough people for that. And he told me that the Foreign Office struggles to find enough graduates who can speak a second official language of the European Union. Not enough of them do, right? And is that related to Brexit? I think it is, in some deeper way, that it demonstrates how gradually the British public, the British people, have lost their interest in things non-British, and I find that disturbing and actually dangerous.
Ed, can I ask you now to give us some analysis, because this is your particular field, about who, as far as you can, who actually supported Brexit in 2016? What was the composition of it?
Okay, I'll try to be quite brief on this, because it is quite complicated, but clearly a lot of people supported Brexit, more than 17 million people, so it's going to be a broad church. It's not going to be just a few small groups. But because we've got data from the British Election Study and similar sources, we can say a fair bit about what those people were like. Just to pick out a couple of things, I think the key thing to understand is not the social demographics as such, but the kinds of political attitudes and values that those people had that voted Brexit, and then look at how those connect to their demographic characteristics, and then you get a better understanding. And really, what Brexit was about this social conservatism. This the people who voted for Brexit were much more socially conservative. That means much more likely to support, to be against immigration, to be against liberal values, to be against the extension of rights to minority groups and so forth. Whereas people wanting to remain in the EU were quite the opposite. And those things are related to demographic characteristics, particularly age and education. So education is really strongly related to Brexit voting, and that's because of these values. Age is very strongly related to Brexit voting, again, because younger people are more liberal. So the kinds of people typically who voted Brexit were younger, who voted to remain would be younger, more liberal. Ethnic minorities would be more likely to support remain, people on higher incomes, all these people with these kinds of values. And I think this relates to broader issues that Dimitris was referring to, and that is the things that are driving people towards Brexit in the first place. And that is these more socially conservative people feel a sense of loss, a sense of their country's been lost, they feel they've been left behind, they distrust politicians, politics hasn't delivered for them, perhaps globalization hasn't delivered for them. So this all kind of ties together, if you like. We can get quite a good picture if we think about how these motivating forces connect to people's social characteristics.
I mean, I'm not for a moment suggesting that you're putting it like this, but there has been quite a strong reaction against the sort of presumption that the people who voted to leave were ill-educated, racially prejudiced and old. Now, you put it in an academic sense, but it has been, it can be taken very offensively by a lot of people, and I would suggest has caused the greater tensions that we've seen even since the referendum.
Sure, because people take averages, take statistics, and they kind of extrapolate that to stereotypes and say that everybody who voted Brexit was uneducated or everybody who voted Brexit was old. And clearly that's not true. As I said to start with, lots of people voted Brexit. Just on average, they tended to be older. On average, they tended to be more likely to be white. On average, they tended to be more socially conservative. But yeah, these things aren't deterministic. But it is true that the higher level of education you have, the less likely you were to vote for Brexit.
Yes,
I mean,
but
that is
in
just
giving that message over, it can be massively misunderstood and people can feel it's own. I'm not, I'm just making observations. That, we may get some questions about that. Now, this is an interesting question I want to ask you, but we keep on hearing now that what did it mean? You know, what were people voting for? What were the expectations? Because, the European Research Group say people just voted to get out, possibly on world trade terms or whatever, whereas other people say, oh, nobody voted not to be in a customs union. Have you got any research at all on what people's expectations, what did actually leaving the European Union mean?
Yeah, we can say something about that because we've been following, in the British Election Study, we've been following the same people, up to 30,000 people, since 2013. So we can actually go back in time and look at what they were saying then about what they wanted and what they expected if Brexit should happen. And as you say, politicians do like to appropriate the outcome of elections and interpret it in a way which is favourable to them. They will say people didn't vote for this or people voted for that. It's actually quite complex. even with these data, it's quite complicated because the actual referendum question was very simple. It was, do you want to leave or remain? So even if we know what those people who voted one way or the other felt or thought about various issues, we don't know for sure what it was that really made their mind up. Even if we ask them, you don't always know why you did something. You don't know why you had a cup of tea. You kind of thought, well, I was thirsty. But people don't always rationalise what they do. But having said that, I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's probably fair to say, looking at the data, that the most important issue to people who voted to leave were immigration and sovereignty. The most important issue to people who voted to remain was the economy. Now, one thing people tended to agree on was they feel that trade with Europe is good for Britain. So I think it would be fair to say that even Leavers and Remainers both think that trade is good, trade with Europe. But Leavers, on the other hand, were very strongly against freedom of movement, very strongly against the power of the European courts over British affairs, and they're very strongly against laws being made in Brussels that affect Britain. Whereas Remainers were much more ambivalent about those things. And at the same time, Leavers were very convinced, that leaving the EU would reduce immigration. So I think one thing that it would be fair for the Brexiteers to say is that people were voting to restrict immigration and they were voting to take back control. I think that would be a reasonable assessment.
Thank you. Well, now let's move forward. We had the vote in 2016. It was quite tight. I'd like to come to you first, Dimitris. The latest polls seem to indicate 55-45 in favour of Remain. But do you think substantially that people have changed their minds since 2016?
Some of them have. And the reasons behind it, I think Ed already mentioned. I mean, I don't have access to that kind of information to be able to give you a definite answer. All I can say is that people are entitled to change their minds. And I think that in a democracy, that should be acknowledged, should be encouraged and accepted. Now, I am not saying here that there needs to be a second referendum as a result of this. All I'm saying is that since this Brexit debate has been so polarizing and has caused so many kind of divisions, that it would be wrong for our society in general not to accept the principle that people's views change, right? History is full of examples of societies that believed one thing and it was very wrong. You can think of the war, you can think of other cases, and they've changed. And they've changed as they realize the consequences of their actions. They change because they might reconsider their calculations on whether something is good or not so good. I am not saying that there is evidence to suggest that many people have changed their mind. My kind of completely amateurish feeling is that some have, but not a huge number. But I defend very strongly the principle that people can change their mind, and it is okay for them to change their mind either way.
Okay, Ed, my instinct is that there's a group of people that weren't around in 2016, and they're the just get on with it group. And this would include certainly the Leavers, but quite a lot of Remainers, people who voted Remain, have not tilted in as you might have expected. Oh, look at all this mess, it's all too hard, we didn't realise the complexities of leaving, let's stay. I detect that there's quite a lot of people who've actually said, for heaven's sake, whatever, get on with it.
I can't
Nothing,
answer that
no
question
stats on
directly.
it, okay.
We may have asked some questions on this, but they're not in my head at the moment. Well, what I can do is give you some actually exclusive data here.
This is on the options, isn't it?
No, this was actually on how people have changed since 2016. We're actually collecting data at the moment in the British Election Study, so we're surveying 30,000 people. But before this evening, I I prepared data from the first half of the survey of about 15,000 people. And just simply in terms of Leave versus Remain, agreed with the figure that you just quoted, Jim, which was our data showed Remain on 55% and Leave on 45% if you just frame it as the same question that was asked in the referendum. So that's shown a gradual increase, but it's not a huge increase. You know, that's not a massive turnaround that would say, oh gosh, if there was a second referendum, it would all turn out differently, because quite clearly it might not. The polls were looking like that when we went into the first referendum. In terms of who's actually, how many people are actually changing their mind, because it's a panel, that means we're following the same people. We can compare what they say now and what they said then. So about 90% of people who voted Remain are still saying they vote Remain. And of the other 10%, about half would switch to say they'd leave and half would switch to say they don't know or they wouldn't vote. That's slightly higher than amongst Leavers. So amongst Leavers, only 80% are still sure they would vote the same way. And again, about half would split to the other side and half would say they don't know. So there is a bit more movement, a bit more tendency of people to be deserting the Leave camp, but it's not huge. And we also interestingly asked about whether people regret whether they vote, how they voted in 2016. We've been asking that ever since the referendum. And it started out very low at 3%, and it's gradually increased, as you might expect, when people have time to change their mind. But it's increased to, I think it was 14% last week. So 14% of people say they regretted how they vote. And again, it...
Regretted having voted what?
Well, that's the question.
Right.
Leavers were slightly more likely to regret how they voted. 16% of Leavers regretted voting to Leave, and 11% of Remainers regretted voting Remain. So it's a difference,
so there's a switch
but
over.
it's not all one-way traffic. You know, it's not quite as it's been portrayed always in the media.
Okay. Now, one other thing I'd like to ask you about is, have you done anything, what the MPs are literally discussing tonight, these various options? I mean, I don't expect people have got into all the complexity of it, but is there any indication of looking at what the MPs are looking at tonight, these alternatives, as to what they might support?
Yeah, sure. We obviously didn't ask them about these 8 very complicated alternatives, but what we did ask people to do is to choose amongst the 3 most obvious alternatives: to Remain, to go with Theresa May's deal, or to leave without a deal. So, and we pitted each of these things kind of head to head, so each one against each of the other ones. And so when you pit no deal against May's deal, it comes out about an equal split. It's about half and half, no clear winner. When you pit Remain against May's deal, Remain comes out on top by about 60 to 40. Remain also beats no deal by a slightly smaller margin, about 55 to 45, so about the same as the Leave Remain split overall. So, yes, Remain seems to be the kind of overall winner of that process, but there's no clear preference of whether people prefer Theresa May's deal or no deal. We did also ask about people's top priorities for a deal. So for Leavers, the top priorities were being able to strike our own trade deals, being able to drop EU regulations, and being able to control immigration. They're the 3 things that Leave voters want out of any deal. And the things that Remainers want are access to the EU markets for British firms and keeping the Anglo-Irish border open. So they're the things that seem to matter most to the Remainers. Interestingly, actually, people aren't that particularly keen on a delay. Although people don't really want no deal, there's a fairly close-run thing between no deal and a delay. And also, people aren't particularly keen on a second referendum. Only 40% said they would favour a second referendum. So there's a kind of mixed messages, right? It's a bit like Parliament, right? Yeah. It's all very well saying Parliament's making a hash of it, right? But the country is divided. There is lots of different possibilities, and there's no particular possibility that's got a clear majority. So Parliament isn't particularly out of step with the people. So yeah.
I've got 2 or 3 more questions, but I'd ask you for brief answers if I may, because I do want to get to the audience. Dimitris, I mean, can or should Brexit be reversed?
Quick answer.
The easy answer is that, of course, it can. If there is a second referendum, and the question in that referendum includes something on remaining, technically, it is possible. Should it be reversed? That's a harder question to answer. I mean, you don't want me to say it, but I am a kind of what you may call a natural remainer, right? I am an EU national, working. My wife is British. My kids are growing up here. But there is a part of me that says, yes, I think I would like that. Having lived here, though, for 25 years, there is another part of me who worries about it. And worries not so much about me. I don't feel that a reversal of Brexit will put me personally in a difficult situation. But what worries me, because I am a political scientist, is what will happen to the 52% that voted to leave in case of Britain remaining? What will it morph into, right? Where will this anger, all this aggression, all this division going to be channeled, right? Whatever happens to Brexit, I think that a very big part of this exercise will be managing disappointment. Whichever way it goes, there will need to be an awful lot of very careful management of people's disappointment.
Right, so I ask you that question, and perhaps you'd also like to take up that point a bit, if you'd like to. What impact, longer-term impact, might this all have on British party politics?
Sure. I mean, I don't normally talk about my own political beliefs, because I kind of think as a political scientist we have to try to be impartial. But it is relevant to this question of whether we should leave, right? So I should premise this by saying I'm a strong supporter of remaining in the EU, or I have been. But I think one of the tests of anyone's own argument should be, well, you know, can it stand up to the questions of people who take the opposite view? And I think the question of a second referendum or revoking Brexit, I don't think stands up to the argument of, is it just, is it fair, in the sense of the double jeopardy of having another referendum when we've already had one. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to maintain a justification for how we can overrule one result and then have a second referendum, which may again be close, and then see that result as being more valid. So from a kind of demographic perspective, it's very problematic to simply ignore the result of a vote. Now, the reasons you might do it are that people have changed their mind. Well, we've already said that they haven't changed their minds that much. It might be that the campaign was misleading, but then again, we don't overturn election results as a rule just because campaigns are misleading.
Never elected government.
Or I think the best argument is that circumstances have changed. We didn't manage to get the deal we expected. But even then, if we were going to say we wanted to see how the negotiations would turn out and then have another referendum on that, that should have been the plan from the start. We can't suddenly turn around now and say, well, actually, we want to change our minds because we didn't like the outcome. So I say that reluctantly because I would like to see us remain in the EU, but I don't think it would be fair.
And what about the impact on British policy? I mean, I heard someone today saying, actually, I mean, it's fashionable to say, oh, well, it's all going to break up and the Tiggers are going to come through and all that. But actually, there's actually a yearning to get back. You know, the left and right poll, which we saw in the 2017 election, you know, a return to sort of 80% of people voting either Labour or Conservative is quite strong in this country. And there'll be quite a quick reversion to the the two-party system, and that the centre ground, which many people feel would be incredibly appropriate for the situation we're in, will remain in impotence for reasons that you may want to explain.
I mean that's absolutely right. And the irony is that the impact that Brexit already has had, which has been pretty huge on party politics, was in 2017 to drive people back to the major parties, because they were having to make a clear choice between, do they prefer a party who was in favour of a relatively hard Brexit, the Conservatives, or do they want to support a party that was more likely to offer a soft Brexit? And the reason it drives them back to the two main parties is because with our electoral system, this kind of first-past-the-post voting system, there are only ever really two viable candidates. It's either the leading party or the second party in any constituency or nationally. So when push comes to shove, people have to say, well, which party is going to deliver my version of Brexit? And I think that's already had a massive effect. Now, that doesn't mean that Brexit will carry on favouring the main parties. It is already exacerbating existing divides within the two major parties. So the Conservatives have been split for years on Brexit, but you can see over the last few weeks and months how the actual process of exiting the EU has brought that to a head, and the European Research Group is now even being referred to as kind of a party within a party. And depending on the outcome of tonight's votes and next week's votes, and whether Theresa May's deal gets passed and whether they vote for customs union, you could see a massive split in Conservative or Labour, because Labour aren't agreed either, right? Most Labour MPs are naturally in favour of Remain, but there are many in the leadership that are naturally Eurosceptic, and there are a large proportion of Labour MPs are in very Leave voting areas. So there's quite a lot of splits there too. So it could work in a completely opposite way.
Okay, people may have questions on that. I've got one last one for you. Taking everything in the round, will the European Union be better off without the United Kingdom permanently nagging away, one foot in, one foot out, or is it going to be a loss?
I think that there are certain areas where the British departure will be very badly felt in the EU. Defence, for example. British departure would also, I guess, harm a little bit the business friendliness that often the British government brings into the European institutions. But in all of that, and beyond Britain, because there is a world beyond Britain, the EU itself is in a desperate need to reform. What happened with the Eurozone crisis, what is happening with Russia, what's happening in the Middle East and so on, necessitates from the European Union to grow deeper. There is no doubt about that. There needs to be more money coming into the EU. There needs to be more redistribution of resources within the EU. The European Union needs to reconnect with the European citizens. And all of these things are the kind of things that the British governments historically did not particularly like. It was often the kind of criticism you hear in Britain about the European Union, but when any proposal comes forward on how to actually deal with these issues, the British government was putting its foot on the brake. So in that sense, Brexit will help the European Union become more efficient, become more united, but you will also be ripping part of Europe's soul out of the system. And that is a tragedy.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, it's over to you now. I think we have roving microphones around. I've got a question down here from John Schultz, and then a question there. Well, let's take that gentleman first, and then John.
Thank you. We've heard tonight, and we've heard quite frequently, about the angst of having a second referendum, because you can't ask the same question. Could you just remind us all how many times Scots have been asked about independence in referenda?
Sorry, how many times?
The Scot Nats.
The Scottish nation has been asked about independence. How many times have they had a referenda on that question?
Twice.
Is it twice?
Yeah, twice, 1979.
So it can be done.
Well,
we had a referendum.
of course it can be.
75 as well.
Of course it can be done. But it's usually a question of what has changed and how much time has passed. And you'll probably remember, if you're talking about Scotland in 2014, that there was talk of this is a once in a generation opportunity, and it's usual that you get to you don't get to vote on the same thing, almost immediately before the decision's even been implemented. So,
But there is a counter-argument to this, in the sense that members of parliament have been asked to vote on the same deal 3 times in the space of 2 weeks, right? But that's not to say, because I believe that the calling of the referendum in the first place has been a terrible mistake. It was wrong. It was wrong practically. It was wrong constitutionally. It upset a balance, a constitutional kind of a delicate constitutional balance in this country that existed for many, many centuries, actually. So would you repair that damage by introducing a new referendum? I don't know. There are people who'd say that a new referendum would be cathartic, right? But there are equally powerful arguments to suggest that people will entrench their positions, and you are likely to be causing a kind of a counterproductive, why are you asking me again, feeling that I often see in where I live. I don't live in Manchester, I live in an insignificant village in Yorkshire, but people there feel very strongly about this, and I can see why the British would find that very hard. The Greeks wouldn't. They don't mind. The French wouldn't, because they've been asked twice in short period of time. There is something about the British psychic, and I can see lots of faces here as we were talking. None of you really, or very few of you, seem to be liking the idea of a second referendum. It's how it is.
Okay. John, down here. And then I'll hope to get some from up there.
Jim, in your introduction, you referred to the Speaker, John Bercow, again repeating the conditions that he would impose on allowing Theresa May's deal to come forward for a 3rd time. But we've also heard people like Oliver Letwin, calm, knowledgeable, experienced, saying it's an irrelevance, because if Theresa May can muster the majority to get a deal through, she can muster the majority to suspend standing orders of Parliament. Who's right, please?
Bercow even said this afternoon he was sort of warning the government against the procedural motion, but we're getting a bit.
And I think you've made the point very well. I don't have much more to say. I don't know. I don't know whether there's any way that he could prevent this apart from refusing them to allow to vote on the procedural motion at all.
I guess one of the beauties of the British Constitution is that it's not written. So you can bypass some things like this. I mean, in all honesty, I don't think that if there is a glimmer of hope by the government that it can get that through, I don't think it will, but say that there is a glimmer that they will bypass it, and I don't think Bercow would have.
I mean, if I may take from the chair try and answer the question, there is a theory that because since Meaningful Vote 2, the departure date in international law has been changed to April the 12th.
Not until a statutory instrument has been passed.
Well, it will be. That will be passed tonight. Well, if it doesn't, then international law is in conflict with domestic law. But we're getting very anarchy here, John. That would be a change. But there is a great deal of surprise that Bercow has again said this afternoon. And if he wasn't to allow, if Mrs May gets the DUP on side and he blocks a meaningful vote on Friday, I think there's going to be quite a row. Anybody? Right over there, please. I'd really like some women to ask questions, if that be possible.
Good evening. Could you give us a summary of the pros and cons of the Mrs May's withdrawal agreement, which I believe, in fact, was actually put to her by the EU? It wasn't actually her agreement. Is that correct?
You want me to?
Please.
The deal that May struck with the European Union was the outcome of intensive negotiation. Now, is it a deal that delivers economic benefits to Britain higher than those Britain enjoys as a member state of the EU? No, right? There are a number of sectors that are likely to suffer a great deal here as a result of May's deal. Agriculture being one of them, and I think that's quite significant. Services will be badly hit. The city will be badly hit. The university sectors perhaps will be badly hit. And a lot of highly competitive research-led industries that flourish in this country, like the pharmaceutical industries and so on, are also likely to be hit. There is, of course, the issue of the backstop, that the obsession with being able to strike your own trade deal created, in a way, the problem with the backstop. So that is, if you like, a minus. Where the deal delivers, and you might agree or disagree with this, is that it provides a cleaner departure from the free movement of people. It provides a cleaner departure from the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy, although it will damage these sectors. That's beyond the point right now. And it delivers on the alleged interference of the European Court of Justice in here. So in many ways, the deal is very compatible, or at least it is compatible with May's red lines. But the question beyond that is, were these red lines good? And my answer is that not really.
Gentleman here.
Thank you. This is a question for Ed. I think this is an area where hard data is very hard to come by. So your efforts with your panel are commendable. My question is, was it 30,000 members? How were they selected, and how confident are you that they're representative of the voting public?
That's a very good question. The British election study has two strategies, actually, for getting a representative sample. The one I've been talking about tonight is based on an internet sample, which is actually it's sampled from something like 500,000 people who signed up to the social media panel with YouGov. Well, not a social media panel, essentially to YouGov's kind of sampling exercise. And that's not totally nationally representative, because people have to volunteer. But then it's it's weighted with a huge number of different detailed weights in order to make it representative on a whole range of different criteria. That's not the gold standard, however, is a kind of random, fully random probability sample where you basically take people's addresses and you visit their homes and collect data that way. That's very expensive. We do that also, but it's a much smaller sample. But we do it as a check against this bigger internet sample as much as anything else. So we did one of these probability samples after the election in 2015 and another one after the election in 2017. But the figures I've been talking about this evening are based on this opt-in kind of sample. But generally speaking, they perform very well. They perform very well because we know a lot about the kinds of people that respond, and we're able to compare them to people who answer this full probability kind of sample.
Okay, thank you.
There is good agreement once you've applied weights, essentially. A weight means that you count people differently depending on whether they're the type of person who's more likely or less likely to respond.
Okay, there's two women, the lady at the back first and then just a bit further forward.
Yes, a question for Professor Ed. In terms of the granular detail of the samples, does it include people who didn't vote in the 2016 referendum?
Yes, it does. Again, as in referring to the previous question, our smaller address-based samples are much better at capturing people who don't vote. So normally we base our analysis of, say, if we're interested in particularly who didn't vote, we'd use those samples. But we do try to capture as many people as we can, whether or not they voted, in both surveys.
Well, in particular, I was interested in people who weren't old enough to be able to.
Yeah, absolutely. We continue recruiting anybody who is of voting age at every single survey. So we keep the people that we surveyed previously if they still want to continue, but we top them up with new respondents, and they will be drawn disproportionately actually from younger age groups, because we're trying to create a...
Yeah, but that is quite a relevant point, because I think I heard in a thing that came out yesterday that of the people, young people who weren't able to vote in 2016, there is quite a heavy Remain influence coming into the your samples from that particular point. So the point's very well made. Just behind you, yes, please.
Hi, so my question is slightly different. I read somewhere recently that during the Blair era, when countries like Romania and Poland first joined the EU, Britain was one of 3 countries, I think, one of only 3 countries that didn't put a staggered approach on how many people could enter the country from those countries. So my question is, do you think that had a big influence on this kind of resentment that may have built within the Leave campaign?
Yes. Can I come to Dimitris first?
The answer is yes. There are. We now know that when the Home Office was sort of running simulations about the impact of the 2004 the East European enlargement into the EU, just before it happened, it estimated that I think approximately 100 or 200,000 East European migrants will move in here. But that was on the assumption that all other EU member states will not restrict the movement, right? But what we know now, of course, is that both Germany and France did. So the number of East European migrants coming to the UK was many times higher than what the Home Office had predicted, right? It was a blunder. It was a mistake, but it was a mistake that was kind of kept quiet and actually tolerated, because at that time, the British economy needed more foreign workers to keep it going. It had reached a point of nearly full employment, so there were not enough people available to do the jobs that needed to be done. So in that sense, the people who arrived here did or contributed to the economic growth of this country, but there were many, many more than what the government had planned for. And that's a problem.
Okay. Lady there, please.
Hello, Professor Papadimitriou, you mentioned something earlier on regarding the lack of skills, regarding the lack of foreign languages, because they're not taken as much right now. And Professor Fieldhouse mentioned that lots of the British public don't necessarily feel that confident in terms of the economy. It doesn't work for them, the globalization, the way they would like to do that. However, in order to find a long-term solution to something like that, we need to ensure that there is sufficient investment in terms of learning foreign languages or acquiring other skills. So if the outcome of the referendum was something that was long years in the making, then in order to resolve that, we will need long years to come.
It's a good point. Everybody says the same. Why don't we train British people to do the jobs that immigrants do? One of the most amazing things that I personally found when I came to this country, and I think in many ways it's unique, at least from at the European level, is here you have a country that does not produce enough doctors. I know of no other country where people don't aspire to be doctors. You know, when I was young, that was my mum's dream. Either become a teacher or a doctor, right? When I told her that I would be a political scientist, she didn't like it at all. There are many countries who do not have nurses. Britain is not exceptional in this, but there are certain, I don't know why that is the case, there are certain gaps in the labour market that it seems impossible to get British people to fill, even though the government has done a lot to attract them. I mean, I've heard that for many years, the government will pay the fees and subsistence to students who wish to do paramedical professions, nurses, physios, and so on. Nobody takes them up. What makes you think that it will happen in the future? I don't know.
I've got, I think, one more question up there, and then I'll come down to this gentleman here.
I'm just interested in the panel's expert opinion on what they think will happen next.
Very good. Yes, it wouldn't be a complete evening if we didn't do that. Ed, what do you think is going to actually happen?
There's so many different permutations, but so I'll just make one prediction. Yeah. Inevitably, it'll be wrong because I'm not very good at predictions. I think, whichever way you look at it, there's very likely to be a general election within the next.
What's that? Sorry, but what? I'm really burning to ask is what's that going to settle?
It's not.
They're very likely to get a hung parliament again, and it doesn't deal with any of these issues. And how could you have a general election in the middle of all this? We'd certainly have to go for an extension, a big extension of the process, which would involve us, first of all, before your general election, we'll be having the European elections. I can't see this, sorry.
I can't see it as a good solution, but I suspect it will. This is where we'll end up, just by...
And what are the parties going to fight on? What are both parties going to say in their manifesto? I mean... Yes, when?
Well, I mean... Within the next 3 months, it'll be called.
Is this after? I mean, seeing so many questions. Is this after the withdrawal agreement?
Well, it depends on.
Are we out of the European Union technically?
Depends. Yeah. So much.
Yeah.
Can I come in on this?
Yes, please.
Experts on Newsnight last night, and all four said exactly what you were saying. They were.
I saw it.
And they all said there would be an election next week.
I think that my prediction will be wrong, by the way, too, but I don't think May will be around for much longer. And I think after many twists and turns, Britain will end up leaving the EU with a soft Brexit.
Yeah.
And in many ways, that is the fairer reflection of the public mood then and now. I think that May's leadership has been catastrophic in that sense. I think she misjudged where the consensus was. And of course, when your own vision clashes with reality, it's never reality's fault, right? It is the job of a British Prime Minister to be able to suss out that consensus. If that consensus cannot be found, it's not consensus's fault. It's the Prime Minister's fault that did not find it, right? And I think that a softer Brexit, which will not, by the way, reflect a lot of the promises that were made during the referendum campaign, will be the one that gets people less unhappy and gets the economy not to implode too much.
Yeah, well, that's a huge, I don't disagree with you, but what happens to the Tory party in that situation? How many Conservatives are going to vote? It's going to split the Tory party down the middle, and are Labour going to come on board for it? Because Mrs May would have to pass that with the Labour Party and with half the Tory party. And if you begin to think of the complexities of that, it's absolutely fascinating. Right up there, please.
Do you consider Brexit to have been a historical inevitability? Or do you think that it only happened because of the 2015 manifesto?
Please.
We touched upon this a little bit before. Nothing in life is inevitable. I think that the best way to see this is Brexit being prepared in the background for many, many years, socially, politically, and in other ways. And then something acts like a catalyst. In that case, it was the misjudgment by Cameron that then facilitates it. So, it wasn't inevitable, because if Cameron has not decided to do it, it would never have happened if Cameron decided not to do the referendum. But the underlying conditions were there. And they just found the opportunity to come to the surface.
I mean, putting it to Cameron's justification was that it was a festering issue, and it needed to be resolved. It's been bubbling under British politics for a long time, and it had to be resolved with a referendum.
Well, it didn't really. I mean, it could have carried on. If not for UKIP,
and you don't think
if not for the threat of UKIP, it could have carried on for.
Would UKIP not
years.
have grown and been a really significant force?
Well, again, this is ifs and buts, right? It wasn't inevitable because UKIP's rise wasn't inevitable. Again, that was down to the issues we were talking about earlier.
Well, they were detecting something, weren't they, UKIP?
Yeah, but that largely happened in relation to the question that was asked by the lady earlier, about the rise in immigration in 2009 or after 2009, and that really precipitated a surge in concern about immigration as an issue, which gave UKIP their platform for their increasing vote share. So again, none of these things are inevitable. They have to be politicised. They have to be made into a political. They need to be made politically relevant for them to actually have any impact.
Sir, please.
Thank you. I just was interested to find out your opinion on a concept for which there is no translation directly into English, and that one is Schadenfreude, which is a German word, obviously, seeking joy in the downfall of others. I think this is reflected in the polarisation among Brexit. I am a vociferous Remainer, I think it's fair to say, and I wouldn't be honest with myself if I didn't feel some schadenfreude with the travails of the Brexit camp right now, but also I appreciate on the other side that is equally valid. This is where we are now, I think, and just to pick up on the feeling that we may be heading for a soft Brexit. Surely that is pleasing no one. The country is incredibly polarised, both on my side as a Remainer who's been on marches and goodness knows what, and on the extreme Brexiter side. So how do we resolve this going forward? That's big question.
No, it's a very, very, very important question. I mean, we could end up with leaving the European Union, but with a continuing sense of dissatisfaction.
Well, as I said previously, there is no obvious solution that commands the support of everybody, and I think there is bound to be a high level of disappointment at best. Downright outrage is possibly more likely, whichever way this turns out.
I mean, if I could, sorry to cut you off, the time's running short, but I'd just like to put it to you that we could leave with this very unsatisfactory situation, which basically leaves us very closely tied to the European Union, but crucially without any say We will be rule takers. And in those circumstances, if a nascent attempt to re-enter the European Union began to get going because it was such an unsatisfactory situation, I mean, A, do you think that it's possible that would happen? And B, what do you think the 27 would say with us knocking on the door in 3 or 4 years' time?
I think it's useful to think here that very often the frustration of British policymakers in Europe was that, the European Union, a lot of talking, the French talk too much, a lot of compromises, a lot of dealing and willing and so on. We don't like this. We need a clear solution, and that is a reflection on the political culture in this country, which is very adversarial, very one side takes all. The electoral system is a bit like that as well. There is, in other words, an inherent characteristic in British society and British politics, of course, that resents compromise. And this, to my mind, is problematic. Because when issues as complex as Brexit become a binary choice, yes or no, well, you can never get a satisfactory answer. In the same way that you cannot have a binary answer to who speaks for the people. Is it the referendum result or is it the parliament? Well, the answer, I'm afraid, is both. Because that's how life is. You can have clear-cut answers to problems that do not lend themselves to a yes or no answer. There needs to be a compromise. The European Union has done a fantastic job in nurturing that kind of spirit of compromise. It's frustrating, it's slow, it is a bit dodgy sometimes, but that's how good politics work. And
but what would you haven't answered, what would a reapplication, very briefly please, what would a reapplication, how would that be received in 3 or 4 years' time?
It won't be a reapplication in 3 or 4 years' time.
So this is for decades?
This is once in a generation, if not more.
Last question to the gentleman up there with the glass. I'm sorry, but I'm giving the wind-up.
Thank you very much. A little bit confused because Dimitris said we were becoming more European because of the manufacturing, food and everything else. Now, you just said previously that culturally, politically, socially, Brexit was brewing up for a while. So there's the paradox situation.
Indeed.
Now, Maastricht, back in 73, as you mentioned, Jim, it was all leading towards, all right, we don't want the twin marauders of Europe doing what they have done in the past, and so for protection purposes, we should be in it. And if we're in it, then we can win it in terms of leading Europe the way we want it to go into the future. I sense that, as most people have, that this is an anti-establishment vote. It was brewing up in that way, rather than the social aspects, the cultural aspects, or the immigration aspects. It's an anti-establishment vote to say, well, 2 fingers to the establishment because we, the people, have our rights and we want to have them returned back to us.
Ed?
No, I think that's... I largely agree with that. I think it is an anti-establishment vote. But part of the reason that anti-establishment vote and that distrust in politics has come about is because we have, for many years, many years, we've had an electoral system, a party system, which is organised around kind of left versus right economic issues, and it doesn't have the complexity to represent people's views on other issues. So issues around social change, issues around liberal values, immigration and so forth, haven't been represented. Hasn't been a party which has been able to offer people who are, say, socially conservative but economically left-wing, hasn't given them a home. So I think this growing sense of the parties that don't do a job is related to that. The things are very, very closely connected. And I think that's happened at a time when social and economic change has been very rapid. Some groups have done very well out of that. Some groups have done less well. And that's just fueled that dissatisfaction.
Okay. I've got to wind it up there. Thank you so much for all your questions. They've been absolutely fabulous. And to our 2 speakers, thank you very much indeed.
It's such a shame to have to wind it up, really. So I hope you've enjoyed the discussions. Thank you to Jim for chairing, to Ed and Dimitris for their insights on how we got to where we are and where we might end up. As we come to the end of the evening, I just wanted to flag our next Incites lecture, the delightfully titled Spatters and Lies, at which Professor Ian Burney will speak on forensic techniques and methods used in criminal investigations, and that's on the 19th of June. Hope you can join us. There's a drinks reception downstairs, but can you join me in another round of applause, please? Thank you.